So behind me is one of the oldest synagogues in the whole world. We're now in Toledo, Spain. The way that you know a museum is honest is whether or not you realize after going through it that the Jews basically were fine under Muslim protection. And when the Muslims were unable to protect the Jews, the Catholics effectively expelled them, and then they had to leave, where they were subsequently murdered by the Protestants in Germany. So the reason that the Jews had to leave was not because of the Muslims early on. So we're looking at over 1,000 years of protection by the Muslims, and only when the Jews trusted the Christians in Spain and everywhere else, after which they were expelled, did that lead to the Holocaust in Europe. And that is not obviously a history that a lot of Western countries that are now effectively trying to erase their own history, whether it's the treatment of the Jews or slavery. That's not something they want to admit. So if you go to a museum, in many cases you're dealing with propaganda, but the way that you know it's not propaganda is whether the way you know if it's honest is whether or not you realize how common and connected the Jews and the Muslims are on any museum that has to do with Islam or Judaism. Because you're dealing not only with cousins, you're dealing with effectively similar languages. The Hebrew language was actually reverse engineered by a Jew under Muslim protection. Because why? Why did the whole language have to be sort of reverse engineered? Because the Christians destroyed everything that they got their hands on. And you can also see that everywhere. It's really simple if you have any sort of understanding of history. The Jews and the Muslims both can't eat pork. They get circumcised. When they go into a temple or a mosque, they have to cover their heads. It's very obvious. The Christians just decided, we don't want to be identified with these people, so you have to cover your head when you go into a courthouse or a church. You can eat pork. You can do all these other things, right, that the Muslims and the Christians can't do. So they wanted to separate everybody themselves from their cousins within the Abrahamic trilogy. And so that's one of the reasons that when you travel to European countries and you go to a museum, you really do want to try to figure out what exactly are you looking at, what kind of history are you effectively learning. The other thing that's interesting is that a mosque over here is called Mezquita. So you can also see relations between Europe and the Middle East and Muslim countries. They're still pretty much frayed, because when the Spanish Catholics expelled the Jews here in 1492 and then expelled the Muslims a decade later, what ended up happening was they took over all the property. They basically stole the property of the Jews. They stole their buildings, they stole their synagogues. If you go into one of the synagogues over here, you'll see IHS on top of, they can't really remove that, right? Now it's also a part of history. And so recently within Toledo, which was built by the Muslims effectively, you can see that they gave back the synagogues to the Jews, right? They give it back to them. But if you go into a mezquita, I don't think there's been that similar transfer back to the Muslims within this community. So you've got a very interesting place over here. I think that it's great to see an honest museum. It's not very common these days, but that's something to think about, especially if you're interested in history.